Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. I heard someone say an hour and 10 minutes. Yes, I live in Staten Island, very far from here, not by distance, but by traffic. There were several accidents, terribly. But alhamdulillah, none were me, and we made it here safely, so alhamdulillah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. We begin in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most beneficent, and we ask Him to send His praises and blessings upon His beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and upon his family, and upon all of those who follow in his footsteps until the day of judgment. Ameen, Ya Rabbil Alameen. So today we're going to talk about Salahuddin, but let's do a very quick recap of what we talked about last week. Who was here last week? I know, Eunice, you were here last week. Anyone here on the sister side who was here from last week? No? Okay, we all have full new crowd. Very good. Okay. That's kind of awkward because it's a two-part series, right? I guess I didn't do a good job last time. So today we're talking about Salahuddin, and just by a very quick show of hands, who here knows Salahuddin Al Ayyubi? Who has heard that name before? Okay, should be a lot of people. I'll ask the second question. Who here knows Nuruddin Zinki? Okay, way less people. Okay, so I think you guys need to watch the first part. That's very important. Because Nuruddin Zinki is actually the more important one. And he's the one who's lesser known. And he's the one who actually contributed more to the benefit of Salahuddin, more than Salahuddin himself. And he's not the one who is well known, even though he really was one of the main revivalists of our ummah and of our history. So Salahuddin, let's go by a quick popcorn, very, very quick answers. What do we know about him? Some people raise their hands. And I want to know if we know just the name or if we know anything about him. So there was a brother on this side who raised his hand. I'm looking straight at you. I'm going to bully you, unfortunately. What do you know about him? Just the name? Okay. You're honest, at least. I appreciate that. Do you know anything else past the name, Annie? He helped defeat the crusades who were occupying Bayt al-Maqdis. That's correct. Anything else on the brother's side before we go to the sisters? Go ahead. No. Masjid al-Umawi was established way before them, and the one who liberates most of Syria from the Crusaders is not Salahuddin, but he's the one who unites it later on, after Nuruddin Zinki also unites it and then passes away. Tayyib. We're going to go to the sister's side. What do we know about Salahuddin? Anyone here have anything that they know about Salahuddin? Okay, go ahead. Okay. Tayyib. So it seems like everyone knows him for just liberating Palestine. What if I told you that's not the most important thing that he did? Not even top 3, honestly. It might be number 4. He did help unite the Muslims, yes, and that is one of the very important things that he did. Let's start by a very basic question. Do we know his name? Ooh. Yusuf, that's correct. His name is Yusuf. His real name is Yusuf. If you guys were here last week, I know you guys are all new today, but last week we covered how they had titles and then they had their real name. So Nuruddin was his title, but his real name is Mahmud. Salahuddin, his title was Salahuddin. That's the title that was given to him at birth. However, his real name is Yusuf. And do we know his ethnicity? Maybe someone else who isn't Niaz. Because I know you know more. Oh, who said Kurdish? So why did you lie and say you don't know about Salahuddin? That's correct. He was Kurdish. That's very good. Kurdish from Tikrit. Tikrit is in Iraq. Okay. Salahuddin Al Ayyubi, funny enough, was actually a footnote in history for most of his upbringing. He was not important. From age 8 until 14 years old, he had one job: to run messages between his father and his uncle. His father was the one who was in Damascus, or Baalbek and then Damascus, and then his uncle was the one who was in between Egypt to southern Syria to Iraq, wherever his special missions took him. So that was Salahuddin's job. Until eventually his dad tells him, look, you've trained enough. You've traveled back and forth enough. I trust you enough. Go work for your uncle. Usually for us, when your dad tells you go work for your uncle, that usually means go work in a deli, right? Or in the dealership. For Salahuddin, it meant go fight in the military or the army that's given the most dangerous missions. So a lot more difficult and a lot more risky than working in the deli. And so Salahuddin spends the next 15 years of his life working with his uncle, Asaduddin Shirkuh. And last week we covered Asaduddin Shirkuh. He's a hero of one of the heroes of Islam, and he is someone who is very intimidating, very powerful, very good at fighting, very good at war, and he's the one who liberates Egypt from the Fatimids, or at least he breaks their military power and becomes in charge of the Fatimi Empire in Egypt. And the Fatimids again were Shia, and they ruled Egypt for 213 years. So I want you to imagine Egypt nowadays, right? The Egypt of today, 110 million people. Islam is, predominant in Egypt. Not just Islam, it's actually very, very heavily Sunni Islam. Shia in Egypt is a very tiny minority, and it's a very recent thing. It only really started since the 1960s. And that happened, imagine that for 213 years, that was not the case. And the Egypt that we see nowadays is actually because of Asaduddin Shirkuh and Salahuddin and Nuruddin. So that goes to show, the impact of effort and how long, how long the impact of what someone does can actually remain. Okay, so Salahuddin goes to Egypt with his uncle, and they break the military power of the Fatimi Empire. And why was this important? Because at that time, again, to set the map, at that time we're talking about a time of great disunity with the Muslims. The norm was that governors would fight each other, empires would fight each other, brothers would fight each other, all for the sake of land. They just cared about having their own little kingdoms. And at the same time, one of the greatest external threats to the Ummah manifested itself in that time in the presence of the Crusader occupation, right? So just to give you an idea, and I wish we had a map. That's my fault. I should have told them in advance. I probably would have been able to get one. But if you look at a map of the Crusader states, you will see a depressing map. You will see a map of occupation, direct control by non-Muslims who killed Muslims, that's at least 5 times as big as the occupation of Palestine today. And there's a lesson in that, which is that if you think you're in the worst period of history, I guarantee you, you have not opened a history book, and you need to read history and see that we are not, in fact, necessarily in the worst period. Yes, some things in our time period now are very different than other time periods. Some things now are worse than other time periods. But if we're talking about, for example, the occupation of Muslim lands, it has definitely been worse. If we're talking about a weakness and disunity that exists amongst Muslims, it has definitely been worse. And that's a very important lesson for us to understand. So Salahuddin really becomes famous in Egypt. That's really when he becomes famous. And again, there's a lesson in that. Because Salahuddin could have spent his entire life as a messenger. He could have spent his entire life as an errand boy for his dad. And I don't say that to demean him. He could have spent his entire life as a lieutenant in his uncle's army. And that could have been it. It could have been fated that this is just someone who shows up, under his uncle in history books, maybe won a couple of battles, maybe survived a couple of sieges, and that's it. That's all he did. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fated for him to be in the right place, in the right moment, in the right time, several times in history. Several times in history. By no virtue or effort or accomplishment of his own. And the lesson in that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's plan is actually the most important and only plan for you to follow. It's important for us to plan and to have an idea of what we want to do. But at the end of the day, the real test is submitting to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to do. Every single one of you has a plan. Every single one of us has a destiny that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has drawn for them. And it could be as big as liberating Palestine. And when I say big, I say by glory and glamour because that's how we're trained to think about it. But that actually isn't the case. It could be liberating Palestine, or it could be being the root of the foundation of the generation that ends up raising the next generation that liberates Palestine. And the mission of Salahuddin is actually an inherited mission that is passed on from generation to generation to generation, starting from 1099 when the Crusaders stepped foot into Muslim lands. So again, that's a very important lesson for us to understand, and that's the context we need to understand Salahuddin's story. An hour is impossible to go through Salahuddin's story. It's impossible. It's physically, like, this isn't something that we can do. So what I'll do instead is give a general skeleton, try to give snapshots alongside the skeleton, and inshallah we'll see how far we can get. And hopefully the goal is to give you all a skeleton of Salahuddin's history and Salahuddin's story, and we can try to fill in as many gaps as we can. So he becomes famous in Egypt because Asaduddin Shirkuh was sent to Egypt 3 times so that he can break the military might of the Fatimids and eventually bring Egypt back into the fold of Quran and Sunnah. And as soon as he's successful, the last time, the 3rd time when he's successful, he becomes the Wazir of Egypt, the Prime Minister of Egypt, and has all of the power of Egypt in his hand. And everyone thinks, okay, this is it. Egypt will come back, and we're moving on Al-Aqsa next year. And in 2 months, Asaduddin passes away from illness. And this is a very important moment in Salahuddin's life because up until this point, he was not the most important or nearly the most important in his uncle's entourage. And yet, with the passing away of Asaduddin Shirkuh, his uncle, the way for him to become the Wazir of Egypt becomes clear. And somehow, in some way, all of the other lieutenants of Asaduddin's army who are higher rank than Salahuddin all agree that Salahuddin has to be the one to lead Egypt in this coming phase. And in fact, this had to be done with the agreement of the Fatimids, because again, the Fatimi Empire was still there. And the Fatimi Empire or the Fatimi Khalifa agrees to Salahuddin as the Wazir. Why? Because they think that Salahuddin is weak. They think that Salahuddin is weak because he's young, because he's not the highest rank in the army of Asaduddin Shirkuh, because he actually doesn't control most of the army. Most of the army is split up on other governors. Because he's a very nice person. His temperament was very honest, very sincere, very incredibly, ridiculously, almost insanely kind. In a way that historians sometimes are very confused. In fact, when we look at what William of Tyre had to say, for example, William of Tyre is one of the most important Crusader historians. And what he says about Salahuddin is that Salahuddin was a saintly, God-fearing, heathen saccharine night. So to understand how confusing that is for the Christian mind, they see someone who in their dogma is a kafir, is going to hell, is a heathen. But they're so confused by his manners, his honor, and his chivalry that they have to come to the conclusion that he must be saintly and God-fearing. And this is very important. Again, there's a very important lesson here. Because that's the quality that made Salahuddin appear weak to his enemies. And that is exactly the quality that yielded him so many of his victories. That's very important. Again, that's the quality that his enemies, the Fatimids, the Crusaders, the other Muslims who go against him, they thought he was weak because of his kindness. But that's actually the quality that made him very strong, because he understood when to use kindness, even if he skewed a lot towards it, and he understood when is the time to not use kindness. And so he becomes the Wazir of Egypt in 1169, and immediately he is tested with several major events that that make or break his rule of Egypt. So imagine Egypt enters into the fold, and Egypt now has a new leader, and he now has to start fixing Egypt. And immediately within a couple of months, there's a coup attempt that happens inside the country by a group of the deep state, effectively, who weren't happy with Salahuddin being in power. And again, they put him in power because they thought he was weak. And then they said, because he's weak, we're going to put him in power, do a military coup on him, and bring back the Fatimi Empire and get rid of the soldiers who came from Syria. And Salahuddin, by the tawfiq of Allah, is able to put down coup after coup, revolution attempt after revolution attempt, plot after plot, conspiracy after conspiracy. And while he's doing that, who's watching? Anyone have any ideas? Who's watching while he's doing that? The Crusaders. The Crusaders are watching. Again, they've occupied everything from, at this point, Jerusalem all the way up to the coast of Anatolia. So if you look at that on a map, that's a huge stretch of land. And they're watching, and they understand Salahuddin is a strategic threat. Strategic threat. Their own historians say that the status quo with the Fatimids was in their favor. And the second Salahuddin stepped into power, they understood that they are now in an existential threat. It is either us or him. He will either take us down, or we will get rid of him and go back to being in power. So within 2 months, what happens? The Crusaders invade Egypt. So imagine, he had just come into power. He has to start undoing a lot of the things that the Fatimids have done in the country. He has to start bringing Islam back into the country. All of a sudden, there's coup attempt. He takes that coup attempt down. Then there's another conspiracy. Takes that conspiracy down. As soon as he's done, he hears that Crusader ships have landed on the northeastern coast of Egypt, and they're looking to split Egypt off from Syria. So he immediately rushes to the city of Dimyat, where the Crusaders laid siege. And what does this teach us? Urgency. Urgency. There is an urgency that the Muslim needs to conduct themselves by. There is an urgency that the Muslim who cares about the Ummah needs to understand and implement and internalize. The Ummah is in danger. We're not going to save it. We're not going to save it. But the urgency comes from the need to save ourselves. The urgency comes from Salahuddin understanding that when he goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's not willing to take the same burden as the other treasonous governors who sat there and watched the Crusaders do whatever they want for 91 years. So that urgency drives Salahuddin to go immediately to Dimyat. And for 50 days straight, 50 days straight of war, battle, and siege, he's fending off the Crusaders from their stranglehold of Dimyat. 50 days. And he had just come out of months of coups and conspiracies. When you look into the lives of people like Salahuddin, Nuruddin, you see there's something in their lives, there's always action. Always action. The action never stops, they never have free time, they never have downtime. It's always one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. Their life is literally a movie. Genuinely, it's a shame we don't have a good movie on it, or a good show about it. Inshallah, Yunus, when you figure out this camera business, we can find an investor who will funnel a lot of money to you and get us a Game of Thrones production quality Salahuddin series and Nuruddin Zinki series and maybe a Mongol series. When you guys do that though, let me know so I can be the historian consultant. Pay me the big bucks. I'm joking. Anyway, so he fends off the siege of Dimyat 50 days straight, and eventually he's able to push the Crusaders back into the sea, away from Egypt, and they get back on their ships and go back to their kingdoms in Asham. After that, there's a lot of things that happen. We're not going to get into them. There's a lot of things that happen in Salahuddin's rule in Egypt. The main thing being that he is working within the Fatimi Empire so that he can bring Egypt back into the fold of Quran and Sunnah. And eventually, he has built enough to the point that he's able to do that. And as soon as he does that, subhanAllah, again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fates that the Khalifa of the Fatimis dies the week after. So as soon as he comes out and declares that the Fatimi Khilafah is done, the Khalifa dies a week later from illness. And this is agreed upon by both Sunni and Shia historians. Salahuddin didn't kill him. He actually just died from illness a week later. And again, going back to what we said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala putting Salahuddin in the right place, in the right time, in the right conditions, with no effort or accomplishment of his own. By the death of the Fatimi Khalifa, Salahuddin becomes the Sultan of Egypt. And being the Sultan of Egypt means that he now commands one of the largest strongholds of Islam against the Crusaders. Nuruddin sees this and he's like, all right, let's go fight the Crusaders. Immediately now, let's go. And Salahuddin tells him, wait, no, hold on, we just got up, we need to get on our feet. We need to get Egypt back up, we need to build Egypt. This isn't Salahuddin being selfish, this is him being strategic. Nuruddin is not too happy with that, because he sees it as insubordination. Remember, Salahuddin, why did he come to Egypt in the first place? Answers. Why did Salahuddin come to Egypt in the first place? He came with his uncle, who was a follower of Nuruddin. So, to Nuruddin, Salahuddin isn't even an equal, he is a follower of him. He worked for him. So he saw it as insubordination. And it turns into a tension between the two. And when the tension bubbles up to the point where it almost becomes kinetic, it almost becomes a conflict, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides to return Nuruddin Zinki to him, and he decides that Nuruddin Zinki is to pass away at this moment. There's a very, very important lesson in this. A very important lesson. That it's very well possible that good people get into conflict. This is very normal. It's very normal that people with good intentions, who do good, who care for the ummah, get into conflict. This is a very normal thing. This is a very acceptable thing, and we have to understand how to navigate it. Even the Sahaba got into conflict with each other. This is a very acceptable thing. But the unity of the Muslims is their most important power, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will protect that by any means. By any means, He will protect that if the intention is clear and sincere and good. And that's what happened here. And because the intention was clear and sincere and good, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided to protect the unity of the Muslims in a way that's very hard for you to imagine. The last thing for you to imagine would be Nuruddin dying. But subhanAllah, him passing away from illness was exactly what happened and what was needed to preserve Nuruddin's legacy as a great reviver and the uniter of the ummah without tarnishing the legacy of Salahuddin. Because imagine, the story that I came to tell here today is how Nuruddin and Salahuddin fought for the next 5 years. Imagine that was the story. You can forget Al-Aqsa. You can forget liberating Bayt al-Maqdis. You can forget defending against the Third Crusade. That's never going to happen. They just fight each other. And so again, it's submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's plan and understanding that His plan is best. I think we're almost at Maghrib, right? How much time do we have? 6 minutes. Okay. Let's get us to Hittin at least. At this point, Salahuddin becomes now the Sultan of Egypt, and he starts to incorporate Ash-Sham into his rule. The Crusaders see that, and again, they're very upset by this. So they get even more and more aggressive. They get more violent. They attack Hajj convoys. They attack merchant convoys. They start threatening the other cities. And the Muslim cities that weren't with Salahuddin, what did they do? They would rely on the Crusaders and ask for their help in fighting against Salahuddin. And so for the next 10 years, Salahuddin spends most of his time fighting Muslims. Fighting Muslims. And there's a lesson in this. Salahuddin would stay away from fighting Muslims as much as he could, but sometimes it was inevitable. And usually because it would come with fighting the Crusaders. And the lesson in this is that the Ummah's affairs will never be fixed if the Ummah's internal affairs are not straightened out. And that doesn't mean that every detail needs to be straightened out. But it means that at a larger level, at a higher level, the very important issues, the ones that can make and break the Ummah from inside, the betrayal, the treachery, that needs to be ironed out before you can even think about taking on external issues. And the other lesson from that is that the Ummah is never defeated because of weakness. The Ummah is never weak. The Ummah is never powerless. Even now, where the Ummah cannot bring in even a bottle of water into Gaza without the permission of the enemy. That's not out of a lack of options. It's out of a decision. It's out of a choice. It is about a conscious decision made to be weak. The Ummah is never powerless. The only thing that makes the Ummah weak and defeatable is its disunity. And to be able to move forward, there has to be unity amongst the Ummah. So we'll talk about the results of that unity, inshallah, after. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Rasulih al-Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. So we ended off before Salah with, again, the story of Salahuddin, and where we stopped was Salahuddin becoming the Sultan of Egypt, Nuruddin Zinki passing away, and of course the lessons that we covered in that. And now we're going to get into what a lot of people think is the meat of the story. Right, now we're going to get into the good stuff. And I want to do some more snapshots, because again, we had to draw the skeleton, we had to draw the context, all of that was very important. But now, alhamdulillah, I think we've gotten more context built out, and we can get into some of the details, the detailed stories, inshallah. And there's a very important story that kind of signifies who Salahuddin is. And again, that trait that I was telling you about, his ridiculous tendency of kindness, his baffling tendency of kindness. I'll give you an example of how he wielded this kindness correctly, right? Or I'll give you guys kind of like a snapshot that really drives the conflict between him and the Crusaders. So there was a Crusader commander who was especially terrible. He was especially terrible. He was so bad that even European historians mention him as a terrible person. Like, you have to be really bad for European historians to think that you're immoral and that you're evil and that you do bad things. Like, that's a really high level of evil, because European historians aren't great and they lionize people who are terrible, objectively evil people. And even they're saying that this guy was beyond the pale. Just to give you an example of how evil this commander was, he would regularly intercept Hajj caravans. He would kill Hujjaj. Actually, at one point, he killed he killed Christian pilgrims. At one point, he killed Christian pilgrims because they were Orthodox and he was Catholic. This is how bad he was, right? So he would kill pilgrims normally. He would intercept pilgrims. He had one very famous incident where he killed an entire caravan of pilgrims, and he did it while insulting the Prophet ﷺ. And like, he left people alive just to go tell the story that this is what I did to your people and this is what I said about your Prophet. One time he tried to actually like execute a conspiracy to dig a tunnel beneath the Prophet ﷺ's grave in Medina, so that he can steal the body of the Prophet ﷺ and, do whatever he wanted to. Alhamdulillah, that conspiracy was thwarted by the Muslims, and his people had to run away. Most of them were killed, but his people had to run away. This is how evil he was. This is an objectively, like, bottom of the barrel Netanyahu level evil, right? And this is someone that Salahuddin swore, if I ever get my hands on this person, I am killing him. There is no if, and, or buts. This is someone who has killed innocent people. This is someone who has created an infamous reputation of cursing the Prophet ﷺ. This is someone who desecrated the rights of Muslims and non-Muslims. This is someone who is an objective threat to the stability of the region. And it is justice to kill him. And so I swear by Allah, this is what Salahuddin says, I swear by Allah, if I get my hands on him, I'm killing him. Fast forward almost 12 years later, in the Battle of Hittin, which is an amazing battle, and again, we might cover the story, let's see. But in the Battle of Hittin, he actually captures this guy. So he finally gets his hands on this guy. And there's another Crusader king, the king of the Crusaders at that point, his name is Joffrey. He also gets captured in Hittin. And because they were the leaders of the army, Salahuddin brings them to his tent so that he can talk with them directly, because they're the leaders of the army and Salahuddin is the leader of the Muslim army, and so you kind of reciprocate a courtesy from leader to leader. So he brings in these two captives. And again, one of them is Joffrey, who is one person, right? He's king of the Crusaders, or the leader of that army at that point. And then there's the other guy, his name is Renaud de Chatillon. I don't want to give too many names because I know it gets confusing. But the point is, one of them is just normal Crusader, which is pretty bad. And then there's really evil Crusader, right? That's the second guy. Salahuddin offers ice cold rose water. That's a very nice thing to do, right? Like, in Ramadan, we got some dishes in the room, right? I see. We have like Ruh Hafza in Ramadan, right? You guys drink that with guests and stuff. Do we have any Syrians in the room? Any Syrians? So do you know what jalab is? You don't know what jalab is, bro? Okay, it's probably the same thing, just a different name then. I think sus is jalab. Yeah. I mean, jalab is similar. But okay, I know what sus is. Okay. Never mind. In Muhim, he offers like ice cold, jalab, ice cold rose water, ice cold drinks. So imagine like in the middle of the Levant desert, in the middle of July, he's offering them ice cold drinks that are, handmade. This is a very is an honor, right? And he's giving it to two captives who were his enemies. He's giving it to one actually. So he gives it to Joffrey, he doesn't give it to Reynaud. So Joffrey drinks from it and then he gives it to Reynaud. And what happens is Salahuddin says, I want to be clear. I didn't give this to you. He did, but I didn't give this to you. You're not safe from me. He's safe from me, but you're not safe from me. Okay? So imagine this is Salahuddin's greatest enemy. Someone who he swore by Allah that if I get my hands on him, I'm killing him. What does Salahuddin do? In that moment, what does he do? Anyone have any guesses? Very obvious answer, he kills him, right? Yeah? You can all agree? It's okay, guys, the cameras aren't live. We can all agree, right? That's the thing he would do. He decides to give him dawah right there. He decides to explain Islam to him, to explain the hereafter to him, and to invite him to Islam. Salahuddin was so intentional on spreading the deen, so kind in spreading the deen, that his most sworn enemy, who is probably the most despicable person on the planet at that time, Salahuddin is willing to break his own oath to Allah for the sake of spreading the deen. So when I tell you an absurd kindness, this is what I mean. A kindness that baffles historians, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, this is what I mean. And by the way, this scene baffles European historians for 700 years. 700 years, they're confused by what this scene and all the other interactions they have with Salahuddin. What do you think the guy does? He accepts Islam to save his skin? No. He's fully evil. He's fully committed to the bit. He's like, absolutely not. I don't need your heathenish, whatever hearsay religion. And so Salahuddin fulfills his oath and kills Reynaud de Chatia. So the point of the story is that Salahuddin had an honor and a chivalry and a kindness that he wielded in a way that's very hard to understand if you're not reading history. It's a very hard thing to understand, even if you read history. And that in itself is his superpower. That in itself is his superpower. And of course, the result of the Battle of Hittin is that the Crusader army is broken. So anyway, that's just one snapshot, right? Salahuddin unites the Muslims again by facing them for 10 years, over 10 years, and eventually he unites the Muslims and now he goes on to fight the Crusaders, right? There is a battle that Salahuddin goes in a place called Al-Karak. I don't know if anyone knows where that is. It's okay if you don't. And I don't want to just keep mentioning names. I know it's not great to follow along personally. But the point is he tries to take over this very strategic and important fortress, and he fights there for months and he loses. A very bitter defeat. You'd think, right? Like Salahuddin is the liberator of, Palestine, the conqueror of Al-Aqsa. This is someone who's never been defeated. No, he's been defeated several times. Several times he's been defeated. In fact, the Crusaders at some point are like, yeah, we thought this guy was a big threat, but he's not actually that big of a threat. Because of how many times he was defeated. He was an excellent military commander, by the way. But this is qadar. This is qadar. This is the whole point of qadar. That you have sometimes you're going to win in the way that's clear to you. And other times, the path to victory is actually more complicated. The path to victory isn't as clear as you decipher it to be. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a different plan. And that moment in Al-Karak is very important for Salahuddin, because Salahuddin understands There's a bunch of tactical things he understands, but at a strategic level, he understands that I need to apply pressure from a different front so that I can get to Palestine. And he decides to go the other way. So Al-Karak is in Jordan nowadays. Instead of going from north down, he decides he's going to go south and then into Palestine from that way. So anyway, several battles. And again, the history is there. You all can read it. You can read these amazing battles. And everything culminates into the amazing showdown of Hittin. Does anyone know what day Hittin happened on? The day will surprise you. I'm saying it for a reason. I'm not just throwing out dates just for the fun of it. The day will actually surprise you. So when you guys think of July 4th, what do you think of? What do you think of July 4th? Fireworks? Why do you think fireworks? So July 4th is National Fireworks Day. It's Independence Day. And it's associated with fireworks. Don't worry, I won't believe that much, but I'll still believe a little bit. It's associated with fireworks and it is America's Independence Day. I, for one, celebrate July 4th. Not America's Independence Day. Just to be clear. July 4th, 1187 is the day of Hittin. And that's the day where the Muslims defeat the Crusader army of Jerusalem. And that's the point where the Muslims can now start to move on to Jerusalem. So next time, July 4th, y'all better be sending happy July 4th texts. But for Hittin, not America. Because we celebrate Hittin. So anyway, Hittin in itself is it's an amazing story. It's an amazing battle. It's a battle that happens almost by accident. And it becomes one of the most devastating battles for the Crusaders. Salahuddin spends months trying to bait the Crusaders out to fight away from their fortresses and in a valley called Hittin. He tries for months. He goes and attacks one city. They don't budge. He moves from another city to lay siege to another city. They don't budge. At some point, he goes after one of the generals. He hears that one of the generals' wives went to another city, and he goes in that city to lay siege to it so that he can draw this general out with his army to defeat him in Hittin. And it's actually that move that causes the Crusaders to go blind with rage and decide, okay, we have to end this guy once and for all. We have to stop him and push him back into Syria. So the Crusaders come together and they make their very large convoy and they go so that they can fight Salahuddin. Salahuddin, again, excellent tactician. Excellent tactician. And again, it's very important to understand Al-Karak. Al-Karak was a bitter defeat. Almost 8,000 of his men killed. Imagine in one day, or not in one day, in one battle, about 3 months long, 8,000 Muslims killed. 8,000 soldiers lost. He learns from that experience, and it's very important for us to learn from that your failures and your mistakes are actually learning moments, not in a cliche way, but in a way where the stakes of the Ummah actually rely on it. So Salahuddin learns from Al-Karak and he employs some tactics. Number one, what does he learn from Al-Karak? The Crusaders wear heavy armor. They wear heavy armor. If you guys ever seen European Knights, like those images of European Knights, y'all seen like that heavy plate armor, right? How much do you guys think that weighs? Any ideas? Any guesses? 10 pounds? How many? 60 to 100, okay. Someone said 10 pounds. The helmet alone weighs 10 pounds. So if anyone has carried a kid on their head, that's like the equivalent of wearing a full plate helmet on your head. Forget the army, just the helmet. So it's actually about 60 to 100 pounds. Taha, you got it right? It's between 60 to 80 pounds, depending on the type of metal. And so they wear very heavy armor. Okay, we don't have any people from the Levant, any Shamis here or any Syrians here. Do we have any Palestinians here? Are you Syrian? Palestinian. Palestine in July. What's the weather like? Hot as hell. Literally hot as hell. Palestine in the middle of July. Hot as hell. So imagine walking in a suit of 80 pounds of metal, marching in the middle of July in Palestine. Imagine that. Terrible idea. Horrible idea. But Salahuddin understands that this is a weakness to exploit. Why? Because if he makes them march for long enough, he can take advantage of the fact that they use a lot of water, so they run out of water, number one. Number two, that it's very hot, so they eventually get exhausted, and that's the moment to attack very quickly at lightning speed. And number three, exploit the weather to make it even hotter for them. How does he do that? So what he does is he watches them as they march. Eventually, they get in a valley, and the valley is a little higher. What does he do? He gets fire, like he gets a bunch of weeds and old trees and stuff at the top of the hill, and he gets a bunch of green plants, and he burns them. Y'all are city people, so I don't know if y'all know much about burning green stuff. Not that green stuff. No need to expose yourselves, but we all smell it. The other green stuff. When you burn green plants that are still alive, it generates a lot of steam and smoke. So he gets at the top of the hill and burns a bunch of steam and smoke and blows it down on them. So that 90-degree weather in that 80-pound suit of heavy metal just turned into 120. And all of a sudden, they're out of water. So what was supposed to be their advantage, which is the heavy armor and their convoys and the way that they march, has now actually turned into their biggest weakness. Does he stop there? No. Because he has to ensure that they go down a path. He has to ensure that he gets them to where he wants them to go. So what does he do? Salahuddin's army was made up of multiple different ethnicities because he united the entire ummah. Do we have any Turkish people in the room? Unfortunate. They usually get happy at this part. Turkish people, Turkish warriors especially, have a historic ability to be able to ride horses and shoot arrows very, very well. Very well. No one, like the only people who did it better than them were the Mongols. So they were very good at riding horses and shooting arrows while on horses. So imagine, you're riding a horse, no hands. I can barely ride a bike with no hands. Forget a horse. Riding horses with no hands. And they have bows and they run straight at the Crusaders, shoot some arrows at them, and then run away. What do you think that does to the Crusaders? They try to chase them. So they're following. And he just sends, squad after squad. They go up, pepper them with arrows, run away. Pepper them with arrows, run away. So they follow the path that he wants them to follow. Gets them into the place with the trap, lights up the smoke, blows the smoke down on them, and all of a sudden, the entire convoy completely separates from each other. Almost 30,000 Crusader troops all become separated from each other. The front realizes that they're all done for and they lose confidence and they're like, yo, forget this guy's wife, we're running away. So that's already, the front of the army runs away. The back of the army is like, yo, we're done for, and then they have like a priest who comes up with a cross that he says is the cross of Jesus. He puts it down and says, we're going to fight until the last whatever. So they fight. The middle is like stuck. But the leader of the army is in the middle and he reinforces half of them. The other half try to run to the sides. Salahuddin realizes this is the moment to attack. He charges and he eventually ends up breaking the middle of the Crusader army and he captures the leader of the army, and that's when the battle is basically decided. To understand how important and how lucky, really, let's call it luck, but it's really qadar. How lucky, how well the stars had to align for this battle to be this effective. In this battle, because Salahuddin went after one of the general's wives, in that city, he laid siege to that city. Because of that one move, he actually united all of the Crusader armies in the area, who initially were actually all competing against each other for rule. And by uniting them all together, he brought all of them out to Hittin. And by bringing them all out to Hittin and then defeating them by exploiting a soldier of Allah, which is the weather. The same exact weather that in the Battle of the Trench manifests itself in winds and blows Quraysh away. The same exact weather that manifests itself in Tabuk and manifests itself as fog to cover the Muslims' retreat. That same exact weather is the weather that works against the Crusaders in that moment. Understand that Salahuddin's story is being in the right place in the right time under the right conditions by Allah's divine intervention. That's the story of Salahuddin. And the fact that all of the armies were united for that one battle, and all of them being broken in that one battle, means that July 5th, the way to Al-Aqsa was clear. No one was left from the Crusaders to stop in the way of the Muslims. And on September 20th, Salahuddin reaches Al-Aqsa and he lays siege to it. And he lays siege to Al-Aqsa for almost 3 weeks. And during that time, he's negotiating with the Crusaders inside Al-Aqsa, even though they were about 600 and he had an army of almost 15,000. Why is he negotiating? Why is Salahuddin negotiating with an army that's way less than him? That is way weaker than him, that he could effectively wipe out? It's because Salahuddin understood that we are Muslims, and he understood that the Crusaders come into Al-Aqsa and they massacre and kill 70,000. When the Muslims come into Al-Aqsa, we do not shed blood. When the Muslims come into Al-Aqsa, we uphold people's rights. When the Muslims come into Al-Aqsa, we protect the rights of Muslims, the rights of Christians, the rights of Jews to worship in a way that is equitable to everybody, even if they're the descendants of the ones who committed the massacre in 1099. And because of that, he insists on taking the city by treaty and not conquest. And eventually, the Crusaders come to an agreement with Salahuddin, where he allows any and all of the Crusaders to leave Al-Aqsa safely, where he allows anyone to leave Al-Aqsa for a small price of 10 dirhams, 10 gold coins, where he says enemy combatants who spent the last 9 decades fighting the Muslims are able and allowed to leave the land freely and go back to Europe where they came from. Where he says churches will not be harmed, synagogues will be rebuilt, and Christian pilgrims will continue to be allowed to come to Al-Aqsa, under the one condition that the Muslims rule Al-Aqsa. And eventually the Crusaders agreed to this. And on the fateful day of October 2nd, the Muslims enter Al-Aqsa. And I want you all to imagine that moment. I want you to imagine the moment that Salahuddin walks into the open gates of Jerusalem. And he passes by Bab al-Amud, the door that leads to the road that goes to Bayt al-Maqdis. And he sees Bayt al-Maqdis for the first time in his life. And he sees that the Crusaders have turned it into a stable, and that it's covered in manure, and it's covered in straw, and it's covered in the excrement of horses and beasts. And he walks into Bayt al-Maqdis for the first time. And the first thing he does is make sajda to Allah of gratitude. And now I want all of us to imagine. I want all of us to imagine the moment we walk into a liberated Aqsa. I want all of us to imagine the last day of this occupation as the settlers are running away and jumping onto flights. And the Muslims are coming to re-establish the justice that was the primordial existence of fact in Al-Aqsa since Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. I want us all to imagine the joy and the takbir of the Palestinian people as they return to their homes after they've been expelled for decades. And I want us all to imagine that moment where the Muslims walk into Bayt al-Maqdis and they see the golden dome of Al-Qubbat al-Sakhra, of the Dome of the Rock. They see the green dome of Al-Masjid al-Qabli, the masjid that is actually considered Masjid al-Aqsa. And you see the courtyards of Al-Aqsa. And you see the gate of Al-Aqsa. And you realize you're standing in the same path of liberation that Salahuddin stood on centuries and centuries and centuries ago. I want you to imagine that moment. And I want that moment to drive every single minute of our lives until we breathe our last. Because we might not get that moment. We might not. It might not be fated that that's what we witness in our lifetime, although I think it's very close. It might not be that we witness that moment. Nuruddin didn't witness that moment. Nuruddin from the start, his mission was Al-Aqsa. The poetry of the time of Nuruddin all talks about liberating Al-Aqsa. Ahmad ad-Din, his father, didn't witness Al-Aqsa. And the poetry of his time talks about the mission to Al-Aqsa. Ahmad ad-Din's father, so the grandfather of Nuruddin, Aqsunkur, never even got to Palestine. Never even got to Palestine. He starts in Syria and ends up dying on the road to Iraq. He never witnessed Al-Aqsa, even though it was his mission. They never witnessed Al-Aqsa, and neither might we. But holding on to that moment makes every step after that intentional. Holding on to that moment makes every step after that steps on the path of a mission, an objective that is worth everything. A mission that is worth laying our lives down. A mission that is worth all of our money. A mission that is worth all of our time and our worry. Because that's how our ancestors took it. And that's how the moment that we find ourselves today behooves us to take it. Salahuddin enters Al-Aqsa as a conqueror, as the Sultan of Egypt, Libya, Hijaz or the Arabian Peninsula, the entirety of Asham, the north of Anatolia or southern modern day Turkey, the Sultan of Iraq. And after he makes a prostration of gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he rolls up his sleeves and starts cleaning Masjid al-Aqsa. No task is beneath you. No task is beneath any of us. If your contribution to liberating Masjid al-Aqsa is cleaning this masjid, then we pick up that broom and do a damn good job at it. Then you pick up that vacuum and vacuum like you are vacuuming on the last day of your life. You put your all into beautifying this masjid. Because that might be what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has fated for us. That might be our contribution. And the reality is, that moment that Salahuddin experienced is paved on the path of so many martyrs and heroes and scholars and warriors who passed before him. And so many nameless people who walked with him and witnessed that day, who we don't know, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. And honestly, that's a much greater honor. That's a much greater honor to only be known by Allah. Because people can look back at history and accuse Salahuddin of being insincere somehow. But they can accuse him of being insincere. They can accuse him of being sectarian. They can accuse him of being oppressive. They can accuse him of being someone who looked out for his own benefit. Very hard to make those arguments, but they can make those accusations. But can they make the accusation to the nameless soldier on his left wing? Can they make that accusation for the random guy who traveled from Sudan all the way to Al-Qahira, who said, I heard the call for Al-Aqsa and I've sold everything and I've come to lay down my life so that I can perhaps maybe see Br.Mosaab, so that I can perhaps maybe smell the jasmine trees of Jerusalem. No one can accuse him of insincerity. No one can accuse that nameless soldier of being insincere. No one can take away his work from him, because the only one who accepted his work was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the enemy that he saw on the battlefield. Be the nameless soldier. Be the nameless soldier. Because wallahi, without them you don't have Salahuddin. There is no generation of Salahuddin. There's Salahuddin, the effective leader. There's Nuruddin, the effective leader. The reviving leaders. And then the nameless soldiers and scholars around them who put them where they were. Be the nameless soldier. If Allah fates for you to be Salahuddin, great. Why not? But wallahi, it's so much easier to be the nameless soldier. And it's so much more impactful to be the nameless soldier. Salahuddin enters Jerusalem on October 2nd, and many great things in Palestine happen in October. He enters on October 2nd, and in the fashion of Salahuddin's life, the action never stops. Upon his entrance into Jerusalem, and within a couple of months, the Crusaders of Europe manifest a massive force of over 350,000 Crusaders to come and retake Jerusalem. And this triggers what's called in history the Third Crusade. And unfortunately, we won't get to talk too much about it. But the Third Crusade is actually the most impressive thing that Salahuddin does. It is actually the most impressive thing and the most impactful thing that he does. Because taking Jerusalem in Hattin in one battle is easy. Defending against the Crusaders with less than a tenth of their forces, with Muslims who are tired of fighting, with governors who tell Salahuddin, go become a martyr by yourself. We've liberated Palestine and we're tired. We're good here. That is a lot more worthy of valor and honor and fame than the Battle of Hattin, as amazing as the Battle of Hattin is. And the Crusaders land in Aqsa, the city of Acre, in northern Palestine. And Salahuddin immediately, with a tiny force of 8,000 men, rushes to stop this massive Crusader force that is manifesting and building itself in Aqsa. It starts with 10,000. The 10,000 turns into 20. The 20 turns into 50. The 50 turns into 150. All of a sudden, we're almost back at square one. And Salahuddin lays siege to Aqsa by himself and his troops of less than 10,000 troops for 3 years straight. 3 years straight. The 53-year-old Salahuddin is sleeping on the floor, beneath nothing but a tent, in the cold winters of Sham, in the mountains that are in the north of Palestine, with the snow and ice and sleet falling on him. And he's content and happy. His own son, Taqiyuddin, passes away while he's besieging Acre so that he can stop the Crusader force from building. And he doesn't leave. He does not go. This mission is far more important than being with his family. The Crusaders betray an army of Muslims. They betray Muslims who surrender to them on the condition of peace. And they slaughter 6,000 Muslims in front of Salahuddin one by one. And that doesn't break his resolve. And after the 3 years pass, he only leaves on the 28th month, or almost the 32nd month, because he realizes these 8,000 troops won't break this city. They're far more useful defending the crown jewel of Jerusalem. And so Salahuddin moves back to give them space. And the Crusaders start to come down south of the coast of Palestine. They leave Aqsa and come down south. Salahuddin tries to intercept them. He's able to get some skirmishes, but he can't stop the advancement. And they keep coming like a horde, taking city after city. City after city, fortress after fortress of areas that Salahuddin has liberated. And Salahuddin is losing men. And he's sending out to the Muslim governors in Syria, to the Muslim governors in Anatolia and modern day Turkey, to the Muslim governors in Iraq. Al-Aqsa is under attack. Come defend Masra Habibukum. Come defend the mission of your Prophet. And no one responds. And he continues alone, defending Palestine, trying to get whatever wins he can. But he continues to retreat and retreat and retreat until he comes down to the southernmost point of Palestine between Al-Quds and Asqalan. Does anyone know where Asqalan is? Anyone know where Asqalan is? It's right north of Gaza. Asqalan is the city, the major city that used to be what Gaza is now. And Asqalan had this massive castle and fortress. And Salahuddin's advisors tell him, we can take them in this fortress. We can defend this castle and we can maybe beat the Crusader force as little as we are. They can besiege the city, but the city is connected to the water. It's only a 3-day ship ride away from Egypt. Egypt is right there and your son is running it. We can bring in reinforcements. But they might take Al-Aqsa. If we go to Asqalan, we leave Al-Aqsa clear and defenseless. And Salahuddin thinks about it and thinks about it and thinks about it. And he comes to the difficult decision of destroying the castle and city of Asqalan. Because he realizes Al-Aqsa has always been the mission. And it is far more honorable to die on its grounds than it is to let it to go back to Crusader heads. And he makes the very difficult and painful decision. And the residents of Asqalan leave the city and destroy it as they're leaving, and they're crying while they do it. They understand the decision, they know it's the right decision, but it's so difficult. Imagine being asked to destroy your own homes after you had just come back. After the city had just been liberated 3 years ago. And now you're being asked to leave your homes. Not just leave it with maybe the promise of return, but wipe your homes out on your way out. Never to be able to come back to those memories. And Salahuddin holes up in Al-Aqsa. At 54 years old, he holes up in Al-Aqsa. And he realizes this may very well be the end. This may very well be the end, but I'm willing to take this mission to the end. And at that point, his army has whittled down to less than 1,000 men. 800 men stand around Salahuddin in the courtyard of Masjid al-Aqsa. In the courtyard of Masjid al-Aqsa. And the Crusaders are less than 20 kilometers away from Al-Quds. And Salahuddin gets up. He leans on his sword and he brandishes it and raises it to the air. And he says, I swear by the one who has created the hadid to repel the oppressors, and cites the ayah in Surah Al-Hadid. I swear by the one who has created might to repel tyranny. I swear to him that I will defend Al-Aqsa even if I am the last man standing. And I will not leave this courtyard except to heaven. And that exact statement is a statement you will hear, or that many of us may have seen, from the journalist, the warrior of truth, Anas al-Sharif, who said, I will not leave Gaza except to Jannah. And Salahuddin makes the same exact oath. I will not leave Al-Aqsa except to Jannah. And the first person that gets up with him is actually one of his oldest enemies, Muzaffar ad-Din Gokpuri, who was someone who, when Salahuddin became Sultan of Egypt, he called Salahuddin a dog that bit his master's hand because he didn't listen to Nur ad-Din Zinki. But Salahuddin's good character and his intention and willingness and clear mission eventually brought Muzaffar ad-Din on his side, to the point that he was actually one of his main commanders. And this old enemy of Salahuddin gets up and he says, Wallahi, I give my life to the same exact oath that you give. And one by one, the 800 men get up and swear their lives to Al-Aqsa for the sake of Allah. And the Crusaders get closer. Day by day, this massive force gets closer until it reaches 8 kilometers away from Jerusalem. And on the day Salahuddin gets up on the ramparts of Jerusalem, he gets up on the castle walls and gets ready to fight the fight of his life. He waits the entire day and sees no one. He says they must be devising a trick. They must be doing something. We'll wait the next day. He sleeps on the castle wall that day. And it rains. It rains as a sign of coming victory. And he sleeps under the rain, waiting for the next day. The next day comes, and he sends his scouts out to the reported location of the Crusaders. And he's found that they've all left. He's found that they all left. The Crusader king, Richard the Lionheart, his half-brother tried to run a coup against him in England. And Richard picked up his coattails, ran to the nearest ship, took his entire army with him, said, forget this Jerusalem stuff. If I stay here, I might lose to Salahuddin, but I'm definitely losing England. And he runs back to England. And that's the story of the end of the Crusades. Yeah. The fitna that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala drew between the disbelievers and the oppressors was their undoing. And all the Muslims needed to do was to stand firm, to be patient, to be persistent in pursuing the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imagine Salahuddin gave up on the last day. Imagine he left Al-Aqsa defenseless. Imagine he didn't make that oath. We'd be telling a completely different story today. And Salahuddin, after that, battered from almost 4 decades of straight fighting the Crusaders with zero breaks. Starts to go around his empire so that he can administer the affairs of the Ummah. And 1 year, almost the next year after, almost 2 years after, he goes out to meet the Hujjaj who were coming from Sham to Mecca and Medina to then visit Al-Aqsa. And he meets them on the path, and then he goes up to Damascus, and he gets sick, and he falls ill, and he passes away a couple of days later in Damascus. This sword of Allah that he's unsheathed against the enemies of justice finally got his rest in Damascus, with his grave still there now. And to show you how impactful the story of Salahuddin was on the psyche of the disbelievers, his story does not end with his death. His story does not end with 1194 with his death. Years later, centuries later, in 1923, Salahuddin, the one who confused the European Christian psyche for centuries, still haunts them in their sleep. That in 1923, when the French enter Damascus, the general of the French army goes to Salahuddin's grave, spits on it, and kicks it. And he says, "We have returned. Salahuddin, we have returned." Anyone who tries to tell you that what is happening today is not a conflict that is deeply rooted in religion on their side is completely foolish. Anyone who tries to tell you that this conflict does not relate to fundamental beliefs about what is right and wrong, fundamental beliefs about the manifestation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, fundamental beliefs about truth at the metaphysical level, has been psyoped. This conflict was always about control of the Holy Lands. And time and history has shown that only the Muslims do it its justice. The majority of Al-Aqsa's history is liberated. The majority of Al-Aqsa's history is under Muslim control. We're living in the anomaly. We're living in the anomaly. Even the Crusaders held Al-Aqsa for longer than the occupation is right now. 91 years the Crusaders held Al-Aqsa. But they still felt all the same. What makes you think that the occupation of today will stand? It's Iron Dome. It's leading in technology. It's great weapons. It's big budget. It's support from the most evil people in the world and the most powerful evil people in the world. None of that matters if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides that their time is up. And the main story from Salahuddin's, or the main lesson from Salahuddin's story, is that it is on us to decide when we will be people worthy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deciding that their time is up. So I ask Allah to make us of those people. And I ask Allah to make us of those who follow in the examples of the greats who have passed amongst us, such as Aqsa, Imaduddin, Nuruddin, Salahuddin, and all of the nameless people who dedicated their entire life to the liberation of Al-Aqsa and the empowerment of the Ummah. I ask Allah to bless us, bless our community, protect us, protect our community, keep us steadfast and firm on His faith, and enable us to in some way be beneficial to the liberation of Al-Aqsa, whether it's in our lifetime or not. Ameen. Jazakumullahu khairan. Sorry I took a couple of more minutes. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.